What you're about to hear will make you shudder. Imagine police officers weeping in horror at what they've seen. Imagine a family where members die one after another under mysterious circumstances. No, this isn't the plot of a mystical thriller. This is a real story that happened to an incredibly charming girl. Daisy Coleman, a young beauty, seemed to have everything one could dream of: a kind heart, a sharp mind, and numerous talents. However, behind the appearance of this charming girl hid a tormented soul that had to endure terrible events at an early age. Daisy was born in the small town of Albany, Missouri, on March 30th, 1997. Her father, Michael, worked as a doctor, and her mother, Melinda, was a veterinarian. Daisy was raised in the Coleman family along with her 3 biological brothers, being the second child. Tragedy struck the family in 2009 when Michael, Daisy, and one of her younger brothers were traveling to a neighboring town for a wrestling competition. During this trip, their car collided with an obstacle on the road and flew into a ditch. Sadly, as a result of this terrible accident, the head of the family died. After losing her father, the Coleman family moved to the larger city of Maryville, also in Missouri. Melinda single-handedly raised her 3 sons and daughter, and although it wasn't easy, she managed her responsibilities. At that time, no one in the Coleman family, who had already experienced a horrific loss, could even imagine the curse that awaited them in the future. Early in the morning of January 8, 2012, 14-year-old Daisy Coleman regained consciousness in the yard of her own house. Outside, there was a bone-chilling cold, with temperatures reaching 0. Daisy was lying on the snow, her hair frozen to the ground. The girl was wearing only a t-shirt and sweatpants. At that moment, the first thought that flashed through Daisy's mind was, "I must be dead." She couldn't get up or call for help. Her speech was slurred and confused. Daisy was crying. With great difficulty, the girl managed to crawl to the front door of the house and bang on it with all her might. The clock showed 5, and it was a real miracle that Daisy's mother, Melinda, who was sleeping in her room, heard a strange knocking at the door through her sleep. At first, she thought it was their dogs that had gotten cold outside and were trying to get into the house. The woman threw on a robe and headed for the front door to let the animals into the warm home. When Melinda opened the door, she saw her daughter Daisy on the threshold. The girl was lying on the cold steps, almost unconscious. She reeked heavily of alcohol, unable to speak, only crying. The mother instantly screamed, calling for her sons to help. The boys woke up, quickly ran downstairs, and carried the frozen Daisy into the house. The whole family was terrified. At first, they tried to warm the girl with blankets, but the mother, upon closely examining her daughter, realized that her legs were most likely severely frostbitten. So the mother filled the bathtub with water and asked her sons to take Daisy to the bathroom, leave her there, and go out. The girl was still unconscious. The mother herself began to undress her daughter and saw huge bruises and red marks on her legs. It was only at this moment that the woman realized something terrible had happened to her beloved Daisy. The mother gently immersed Daisy in a bathtub with cool water. As a veterinarian, she knew well how to provide first aid for frostbite. The woman gradually increased the water temperature in the bathtub, thus slowly warming her daughter's body. Fortunately, she managed to help Daisy. Soon the girl warmed up, but her speech remained unclear and confused. It was difficult for Daisy to speak, so the alarmed Melinda called 911 and summoned the police. When the police officers arrived at the scene, they immediately began examining Daisy. However, the girl was still under the influence of alcohol, and her mind was clouded, so she couldn't clearly recount the events of the previous night. Under these circumstances, the police had to turn to Daisy's friend, Paige, who was also at the Coleman family's house that night and slept in the same room as Daisy. Paige shared her version of the events with the officers. As her friend recounted, on Saturday, January 7th, 2012, Daisy invited her best friend Paige to her house for a sleepover. In the evening, the girls decided to watch a few horror movies, and for a greater effect, drank strong alcoholic beverages that they had secretly stolen from the Coleman family's home bar. Closer to midnight, Daisy began exchanging messages with her older brother's friend, 17-year-old Matthew Bonnet, who was the star of the school football team. Upon learning that Daisy was spending the night with a friend, Matthew sent the girls a message proposing they have fun at his place.
Daisy and Paige enthusiastically agreed to this adventure and arranged to meet with Matthew and his friends. Around 1 o'clock in the morning on January 8th, the girlfriends snuck out of Daisy's house through her bedroom window and ran around the corner, where Matthew and 4 of his friends were already waiting for them. The boys escorted the girls to Matthew's house, helped them get through the window into the basement, and asked them to be quiet so as not to wake up Barnett's parents, who were sleeping upstairs. According to Paige, as soon as she and Daisy found themselves in the basement, Matthew immediately began treating Daisy to alcohol. Paige sat nearby and watched as her friend drank one glass after another, almost without stopping. At some point, one of the boys, named Nicholas, approached Paige, took her hand, and led her to a neighboring empty room in the basement. There, at the young man's initiative, they had sexual intercourse. Meanwhile, Matthew and Daisy went to another room where there was a large bed. Several times, when the door opened, Paige was able to see what was happening in that room with Daisy. The girl was lying on the bed, barely conscious, unable to speak or move. Matthew took advantage of her helpless state and engaged in sexual intercourse with Daisy. His friend Jordan Zetch filmed everything that was happening on his smartphone camera. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the boys decided it was time to go home. They put the girls in the car and drove them to the Coleman family's house. Paige got out of the car first. Matthew told her that Daisy should sit outside in the fresh air to sober up. The boys assured that they would stay with Daisy and take care of her safety outside. They advised Paige to go home and go to bed. The friend believed their words and agreed to go alone. Paige got to the house, climbed through the window into Daisy's bedroom, fell on the bed, and instantly fell asleep. At this time, the boys pulled Daisy out of the car, set her on her feet, and supported her so she wouldn't fall. The girl got sick, so they took off her shoes, took her purse and cell phone, and held her hair while she vomited. Then they gently laid Daisy on the cold ground near the house. Fearing that they might be noticed and not wanting to take risks, the young men quickly got into the car and drove away. Daisy lay outside for about 3 hours in the bitter cold at 0 temperature. She was wearing only a t-shirt and sweatpants, without socks or shoes. Her hair was wet and frozen. Arriving at the scene on a call, the police officers thoroughly examined the Coleman family's house and the surrounding area. In Daisy's room, they came across 5 empty plastic bottles of alcoholic beverages. In the yard, they found Daisy's bag, her cell phone, shoes, and traces of vomit. That same morning, the victim was taken to the hospital for a medical examination. During the examination, numerous bruises on her legs and tears in the groin area were recorded on Daisy's body. The girl had several tests taken, one of which showed that the alcohol level in her blood was almost twice the maximum allowable limit. After a few hours in the hospital, Daisy finally regained consciousness. She reported that she did not remember any details of the previous night. The girl could not reproduce the details of what happened and admitted that she had drunk too much alcohol. However, Daisy did not deny the fact that she had taken alcoholic beverages from the home bar without her mother's permission and secretly ran away at night to the company of boys. Around 11 a.m. on January 8th, a few hours after the incident, law enforcement officers located Matthew Barnett, Jordan Zetch, and Nicholas Graumaudis. They were charged and all 3 were taken to the police station for interrogation. During questioning, Matthew Barnett did not deny having intimate relations with Daisy Coleman that night. However, he insisted that everything happened by mutual consent. The boy said that when he met Daisy and her friend Paige, the girls were already intoxicated. At first, Matthew denied treating Daisy to alcohol, but the more he spoke, the more entangled he became in his own testimony. Eventually, he did confess to treating Daisy to a few shots of strong drinks to melt her icy heart. Matthew reported that during intercourse, he used a condom, which he threw away on the way back to Daisy's house. Another person involved in the case, Jordan Zetch, initially refused to testify but later admitted to using his friend Nicholas' smartphone to record a video of Matthew kissing Daisy. The video lasted about 10 seconds. Jordan managed to show this video to his friends, but then, getting scared, deleted it. Nicholas, who had sexual intercourse with Daisy's friend Paige, was the only one who immediately fully admitted his guilt. He was sent to a juvenile detention center. Matthew's friend, who drove the boys and girls in his car to Daisy's house, said that throughout the ride, Daisy wouldn't stop crying, and Matthew expressed fears that the girl's brother Charlie would kill him if he found out what happened. At the same time, it became known that a few days before the terrible incident, Matthew had already visited the Coleman's home. That time, he had a peaceful dinner with the family at the same table in a friendly atmosphere. At 1 p.m. on January 8th, a search was conducted in the basement of Matthew Barnett's house. Police officers seized bed linen, several empty bottles, men's underwear, and plastic cups. During repeated interrogations, the sheriff's assistant, while talking to Matthew, was moved by the young man's story. At one point, the officer even suggested that girls often resort to such actions to attract attention. and it is quite possible that this case is one of those. The sheriff's assistant praised Matthew for taking care of the girl and driving her home. However, for some reason, the fact that the boy left Daisy alone to freeze on the street did not attract the officer's proper attention. Several days passed, and Daisy Coleman's health condition completely normalized. Her life was no longer in danger. However, the girl still could not recall any new details of that terrible night. 2 months later, in March 2012, all charges against Matthew Barnett and Jordan Zetch were completely dropped. The district attorney concluded that the intimate relationship between the young people occurred by mutual consent. The video recording that Jordan made that night could not be restored after deletion, although several of Jordan's classmates claimed they saw footage of Matthew kissing Daisy. During the analysis of the couple's smartphones, the investigation found out that Matthew and Daisy maintained telephone communication about once a month. In text messages, Daisy hinted to Matthew that she was ready to have sexual intercourse with him in exchange for a bottle of strong alcohol. In addition, correspondence was found dating back to before January 8th, in which Daisy and Matthew exchanged explicit messages of a sexual nature. After Matthew's release from custody, it became known that he was the grandson of an influential political figure, Rex Barnett, who had previously been a member of the state legislative assembly. Rex Barnett was a member of the Committee on Criminal Law and Public Safety. He had close ties with many prosecutors and police officers throughout the state of Missouri. Matthew and Jordan were released, and the boys returned to their normal lives. At the same time, Daisy Coleman hoped that the hype surrounding her nightly adventure would finally subside. The girl continued her education, but instead of support from her peers, she faced open hostility and ridicule. Most of her acquaintances sided with Matthew, and Daisy began to be called a liar and a slut. She instantly turned into an outcast, withdrew into herself, and tried to spend as much time as possible at home alone. Daisy, who had previously led an active social and public life, was involved in sports and dancing, now simply disappeared from sight. Moreover, the girl was forced to leave the school cheerleading squad. Daisy's mother, Melinda, began receiving anonymous threats daily, both at home and at work. Soon, the woman was asked to quit her job at the veterinary clinic, where she had worked for many years. After that, the Coleman family realized that they could no longer stay in the town of Maryville and decided to move to another place. In the spring of 2013, their empty house in Maryville, put up for sale, burned to the ground. The police never managed to establish the cause of the fire. There were rumors that Matthew Barnett's father was involved. Some time later, under extremely mysterious circumstances, the house of Daisy's friend named Paige also burned down. By that time, the girls had already stopped communicating. By the way, Paige also became an outcast at school. It is known that the girl suffered from nightmares for a long time. As time passed, Daisy's story attracted the attention of the media. The girl began receiving active support from people across the country, especially those who had experienced similar traumatic experiences. Thanks to this, Daisy managed to reopen the case against her main offender, Matthew Barnett. The case went to trial, but the boy was found guilty only of leaving Daisy alone in the cold in the middle of the night. Matthew Barnett was sentenced to 2 years of probation and ordered to pay the Coleman family $2,800 in compensation. The other defendants in the case avoided any charges. Daisy Coleman continued to live her life, but regularly encountered not only words of support, but also threats from anonymous users on the internet. She understood how unfairly people behaved. Daisy took every negative message addressed to her very painfully. In 2016, when 19-year-old Daisy was studying in college, a documentary film titled Audrey and Daisy was released on the Netflix streaming service. The film told the story of violence, bullying, harassment on social networks, and the detrimental consequences this can lead to in the future. Daisy became one of the main characters of the film and shared her story. However, the fate of the second heroine, Audrey Pott from California, turned out to be even more tragic. Almost the same thing happened to Audrey as to Daisy Coleman in 2012. But unlike Daisy, Audrey was unable to cope morally with what happened. The girl's photos quickly spread across the network. Both Audrey's friends and enemies saw them. The last post she left on her social media page contained the following words: "My life is ruined. The whole school knows. I will never get rid of this reputation. Everyone knows how bad I am. I want it all to end." 9 days later, Audrey took her own life. She could not withstand the humiliation that fell upon her from all sides. Audrey's parents were able to initiate a criminal case only 6 months after their daughter's death. The The perpetrators, 3 boys, were sentenced to terms ranging from 30 to 45 days. Later, their families paid Audrey's parents about $1 million in moral compensation. Let's return to Daisy Coleman. In 2018, seeking to start life with a clean slate, the girl moved to the state of Colorado, where she got a job at a tattoo parlor. At the same time, she worked on creating a second film project, which focused on the process of her own recovery. However, in June 2018, Daisy faced another shock. Her mother Melinda and brother Tristan got into a car accident while driving to Daisy from their hometown. As a result of the accident, 19-year-old Tristan died. The circumstances of this tragedy remain unknown to this day. After losing her brother, Daisy published a post on social media in which she admitted that every day it became more and more difficult for her to keep her inner demons under control, to put on a smile, and to pretend that everything was fine. After Tristan's death, Daisy co-founded a charitable organization that supported victims of violence. She continued to share her personal tragedy and provide support to other people who found themselves in similar situations. In her publications, Daisy repeatedly talked about how sometimes it was difficult for her to cope with the thoughts swirling in her head. She struggled with emotional pain, panic attacks, and constant terrible memories. In the summer of 2020, 23-year-old Daisy Coleman began sharing disturbing details with her friends. She was being stalked by an unknown man who constantly sent her threats. The girl went to the police and filed a statement that a stranger had been following her since December 2019. Daisy desperately pleaded for help, but her pleas went unanswered. On Tuesday, August 4th, 2020, she published a tweet in which she admitted that she was afraid to leave the house. Daisy wrote that she couldn't even walk her dog or go to work because of the overwhelming fear. She also reported that she had lost her appetite and couldn't sleep. A few hours later, a new post from Daisy appeared on Facebook. She said that some man had approached her house and knocked on the door. The girl confessed that she was very scared. She suggested that this man might have previously stolen her keys, and now it would not be difficult for him to get into her home. In addition, Daisy reported that the unknown man had stolen her photos and registered on one of the sites, where he offered intimate services for money on her behalf. Melinda, Daisy's mother, upon stumbling upon her daughter's message on social media, immediately called the Colorado police asking them to check on the girl. At 4 p.m., officers arrived at Daisy's home. She let them into the house, and the police spent about an hour with her. The girl again told them about being stalked by an unknown man. The officers did not notice anything suspicious in Daisy's behavior. But shortly after the law enforcement officers left, 23-year-old Daisy Coleman contacted her boyfriend via video call. During the conversation, she suddenly took out a gun, pointed it at herself, and pulled the trigger. Her boyfriend did not immediately realize what had happened. The connection was cut off. Daisy stopped answering calls. Frightened, the young man dialed 911. When the police officers arrived at Daisy Coleman's house again at 8 p.m., they found the girl already dead. One of the police officers couldn't hold back and burst into tears at the sight. The girl had a fatal gunshot wound. She was lying in a pool of blood. Melinda, Daisy's mother, reported her daughter's death in a post on her social media page. She wrote, "Daisy was my best friend and a wonderful daughter. How I wish I could take her pain away. She never recovered from what those boys did to her back in school. It's just not fair. My girl is gone from us." The woman said that she had fought for Daisy and her mental health for many years. She believed that she had done everything possible for her beloved daughter. The mother also confirmed that in recent months, Daisy was indeed being stalked, and just recently, the girl found out that she would never be able to have children. After Daisy's death, the tattoo parlor where she worked was robbed. The perpetrator stole an album with Daisy's exclusive sketches and her tattoo machine. 4 months passed. In December 2020, 58-year-old Melinda Coleman published another heartfelt post on social media dedicated to her beloved daughter. And soon after, the woman took a gun in her hands and did the same as Daisy. Only 2 sons remained in the Coleman family, the older Charlie and the younger Logan. The charitable organization founded by Daisy organized a fundraiser to support the boys. It became known that Matthew Barnett's life and career were going well. After the death of Daisy and her mother Melinda, he expressed words of sympathy about the tragedy that befell the Coleman family. "I hope that Daisy's story will be the impetus for change in our society. We must create a world in which no child will suffer from violence, where every voice will be heard, and every victim will receive support and justice. Thank you for being with me and listening to this difficult story. I love each and every one of you. May the memory of Daisy Coleman forever remain in our hearts as a reminder that love, compassion, and support are what make us human. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.
Now you see the most notorious serial killer in Canada, who evaded justice for 20 years. He didn't just kill his victims, he fed their remains to pigs. Yes, unfortunately, you heard that right. Robert William Pickton was born on October 24, 1949, into a dysfunctional teenage family in British Columbia, Canada. His biological parents, Leonard and Louise Pickton, were too young and immature to raise a child, so they gave Robert up for adoption to a couple from their church, Donald and Linda Pickton, who already had 2 daughters. Robert's adoptive parents were farmers, and he was raised along with his brother David on their pig farm in Port Coquitlam, a suburb of Vancouver. Leonard Pickton was a strict and reclusive father who rarely showed attention to Robert, and when he did, it was mostly to beat or humiliate him. In contrast, Robert was extremely attached to his mother, Louise, who openly favored him over the other children. Louise Pickton was quite eccentric and untidy. By middle age, all her teeth had rotted due to a complete lack of hygiene, and she had lost her hair, replacing it with a thick beard and mustache. She constantly walked around the farm in a dirty housecoat, loose jeans, and huge rubber boots. However, Robert adored his mother and spent all his free time with her. The Pickton family lived a fairly isolated life on their farm. The farm was cluttered with junk and debris, and the house had an unbearable stench since pigs, chickens, and dogs roamed freely inside, leaving their excrement everywhere, which no one cleaned up. The Pickton children were forced to feed the pigs twice a day, always covered in manure and stench that they never washed off. This was especially true for Robert, who had a phobia of water and never took a shower. The unsanitary conditions and poverty affected the children's social lives. At school, Robert was constantly bullied for his peculiar smell and lack of hygiene. He also significantly lagged in his studies, attending only special needs classes. Eventually, at 15, Robert was expelled from school for distributing pornographic magazines. This only pleased his mother, who now had a permanent helper on the farm. Robert's brother, David, although growing up in the same conditions, managed to adapt better. He had more friends, dated girls, and even occasionally took showers. However, from the age of 16, David had trouble with the law. In 1967, he hit a 14-year-old boy, Tim Barrett, with a truck, causing serious injuries. Instead of calling an ambulance, David fled the scene. His parents, upon learning about this, decided to cover up the crime. Leonard immediately started cleaning the blood and repairing the truck, while Louise threw the injured boy's semi-conscious body into a roadside ditch where he soon drowned. Louise later confessed this episode to a friend. Despite a thriving farming and meat business, the Picktons continued to live like beggars. They constantly scavenged dumpsters for food and junk, which they brought home. Leonard always smelled of manure and even took pride in his nickname, Piggy. The most traumatic experience of Robert Pickton's childhood happened when he was 12. The boy went to a livestock auction and bought a cute calf for $35, which he had earned himself to raise on the farm. For several weeks, Robert cared for and pampered his pet until one day, after coming home from school, he didn't find it in the barn. Horrified, Robert saw the calf hanging by its legs from the ceiling, slaughtered. Behind him, a quiet laugh sounded. It was Leonard Pickton, who decided to cruelly prank his son. This event deeply traumatized Robert's psyche. In his youth, Robert's responsibilities on the farm only grew. When the family moved to a new farm in Coquitlam, Robert and David fed the pigs 3 times a day, after school and on weekends. During this time, Robert found a job as a butcher's assistant and gained skills in slaughtering and butchering animals. Meanwhile, David worked in house demolition. The death of their parents in 1978 to 1979 made the Pickton brothers the official owners of the family farm and a multi-million-dollar business. Each of them, including their sister Linda, received a substantial inheritance. However, Robert's share was limited by additional conditions, possibly due to his parents understanding his instability. With the farm in their possession, the Pickton brothers somewhat expanded their activities. The farm became a junkyard for old cars and scrap metal. Robert actively developed his meat business, buying animals at auctions and slaughtering them for the locals. The farm gradually became a gathering place for various criminal elements who hung out there, unaware of the grim secrets of its owner.
Overall, Robert Pickton's childhood and youth were marked by numerous psychological traumas due to the lack of parental love and upbringing, as well as the horrible living conditions. As an adult, Robert continued to live as a recluse in the poverty and unsanitary conditions he was accustomed to from childhood. Only the job as a butcher gave him some satisfaction, but later, he would channel his love for violence and blood into the most terrifying direction, specifically into a neighborhood known as East Side. East Side, or Low Track, as it is more commonly known by locals and the police, is the poorest and most destitute area not only in Vancouver or British Columbia, but in all of Canada. This urban wasteland, consisting of a dozen blocks filled with cheap hotels, pawn shops, and ruins, contrasts sharply with Vancouver's image as one of the most beautiful and prosperous cities in the world. Low Track earned its nickname, Dollar and Vein, Pain and Vanity, from its main artery, the intersection of Main and Hastings. This area has the highest concentration of drug-dependent people in the city, with official data reporting between 5,000 and 10,000 individuals. Strong psychotropic substances supplied by Latin American gangs and Asian triads are the most popular among the local residents. The majority of drug-dependent women in Low Track earn their living through prostitution and live on the streets around the clock. Their appearance is so horrifying that one reporter aptly described it as the result of a crack diet. Safe sex is unheard of here, hence Low Track has the highest HIV infection rate in North America. According to a 1995 survey, 73% of East Side women started prostituting themselves as children. The same percentage were unmarried mothers with an average of 3 children, 90% of whom were lost to social services intervention. Less than half knew where their children were. Notably, over 80% of Low Track sex workers were born outside of Vancouver and ended up here in search of a better life. The history of East Side is a chronicle of endless human tragedies. Initially, the neighborhood was flooded with homeless and unemployed people who flocked to Vancouver hoping to get rich at Expo 86. Around the same time, cartels flooded the area with cheap drugs, breaking the lives of an entire generation. Religious communities, in an attempt to beautify their streets, drove sex workers into this very cesspool. The final blow to Low Track was dealt in the 1990s. Federal welfare cuts in 1994 left many without means of subsistence, and psychiatric hospitals dumped their patients onto the streets. By 1997, rampant promiscuity and drug addiction caused an HIV epidemic, infecting 1 in 4 residents of the neighborhood. Government needle exchange programs, distributing up to 3 million units annually, failed to stop the epidemic. By the way, what do you know about this neighborhood? In 1998, an average of 1 person died daily from an overdose in East Side. But it turned out that drugs weren't the only threat to the destitute here. A few years before Expo 86, the first disappearance of a woman from Low Track occurred, which the police ignored. It wasn't until 14 years later, when the number of missing women numbered in the dozens, that attention was finally paid. Prostitutes are a very elusive category of victims. Usually, they are runaway girls who constantly change names and addresses, hiding from everyone. So when they disappear, it's hard to determine if it was voluntary or forced. Investigators had little chance of tracking the fate of individual women. However, over time, a sinister pattern emerged in the disappearances of Low Track prostitutes. One of the first to disappear was Rebecca Guno on June 22, 1983. But most victims were reported missing only months or even years later. For instance, Teresa Williams, who disappeared in July 1988, was reported missing in March 1989. Kathleen Watley, last seen in June 1992, was searched for only at the end of the month. During this time, the perpetrator only intensified his activities, shortening the intervals between abductions. From August 1997 to October 1998, 6 more women disappeared. It was during this period that Robert William Picton, a 48-year-old failed farmer from Port Coquitlam, appeared on the police radar. Almost all the missing women were seen in the company of this reclusive man who constantly roamed East Hastings in search of cheap women and drugs. Picton was well known in local brothels and drug dens and readily bought services and goods without bargaining. According to eyewitnesses, Picton lured prostitutes with promises of drugs, money, and shelter on his farm. Many fell for his tales of a better life away from Low Track. Getting into Picton's smelly van, the poor souls had no idea they were heading to their own funerals. Since 1980, Picton regularly visited a waste processing plant where he disposed of animal remains from his farm. This place was located a block from East Hastings, making it easy for the farmer to combine his legitimate business with his gruesome hunting of women. According to a police task force report from 1998, in just the last 3 months, Picton had taken at least 4 women from East Side. Another 4 women had dropped off his radar because they either died of overdoses or escaped from the terrifying death factory. However, the police discovered the existing victims too late. Thus, thanks to a fatal combination of circumstances, the authorities' indifference, the imperfections of the laws, and the murderous cynicism, East Side became Picton's ideal hunting ground for many years. Low Track supplied the maniac with new victims, and he turned them into missing persons and fed their remains to his pigs. It wasn't until the persistence of certain detectives and the relatives of the deceased forced the police to at least start investigating the series of mysterious disappearances that had swept the scariest neighborhood in Vancouver. In the mid-1990s, brothers Robert and Dave Picton began hosting loud parties on their pig farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. These large gatherings, known as Piggy Palace, attracted hundreds of people and became a popular entertainment venue not only for local criminals but also for ordinary residents and even off-duty police officers. The Piggy Palace was officially registered as an entertainment business. It had security, bartenders, live music, and a spacious dance floor. On successful nights, the Picton brothers earned between $10,000 and $40,000 Canadian dollars per party. These profits, along with their meat and pig farming business, allowed Robert and Dave to significantly increase their wealth. Robert Picton, with years of experience as a butcher and meat cutter, was responsible for slaughtering livestock on the farm. He bought animals, often sick and covered in ulcers, at low prices at auctions. The animals were then slaughtered and hung by their legs. Afterward, Robert butchered the carcasses, and the meat was sold to customers or stored in refrigerated rooms. Animal remains unsuitable for human consumption were taken by Robert to a waste disposal plant in Vancouver. This facility was located a few blocks from East Side, the poorest and most crime-ridden area of the city, known for its brothels, drug dens, and high concentration of homeless people. Starting in 1995, the number of missing persons in this area skyrocketed. Although the victims' acquaintances repeatedly reported to the police, the authorities did not show much concern for the fate of marginalized women. Meanwhile, Robert, like his brother Dave, led an active social life. He frequently visited local bars and met women, some of whom even lived with him in a trailer on the farm. During one such cohabitation with a woman named Tanya Carr between 1992 and 1995, Robert temporarily suspended his criminal activities. But this lull did not last long. Once Tanya left, he resumed hunting for victims. One time in 1995, Robert brought a woman named Tracy, a sex worker from East Side, to the farm. In his trailer, filled with women's clothes and jewelry, Robert tried to force Tracy to look for his wallet and then threatened her with a knife. Eventually, he let the frightened woman go, driving her back to the city. On the way, Robert boasted that he was a white knight who saved bad women and gave them a second chance. At the same time, he threatened to kill those he couldn't fix. Tracy was lucky to survive this terrifying encounter. However, other victims of Robert Picton were not so fortunate. In 1995, near the farm, an unidentified woman's skull was found, sawed in half and showing signs of long-term storage in a freezer. An autopsy revealed that the skull was cut with the skills of a professional butcher. Despite this, Robert Picton remained out of suspicion for a long time, and his criminal activities gained momentum. The killer's brutality increased, the number of victims grew, but the police did not take decisive action. Parties at Piggy Palace continued to bring the Pictons huge profits, which no one paid attention to. The lack of oversight from the authorities allowed the farm to become a den of debauchery and crime. Even explicit hints of Robert's involvement in the disappearances of homeless women, voiced by his former lover Lisa Wells, did not prompt immediate police action. Only in the early 2000s, when the number of missing women from East Side reached dozens, did the police finally begin a thorough investigation. By that time, Robert Picton had become one of the most terrifying serial killers in Canadian history. In the early 1990s, Vancouver police began receiving increasing reports of women going missing in the East Side area. Most of these women were involved in the sex industry and led marginalized lives, complicating the investigation of their disappearances. Often, relatives and friends of the missing did not immediately report to the police, and when they did, they encountered a skeptical attitude from the authorities. The police did not see a connection between the numerous disappearances for a long time and did not give them proper attention. Such women often moved from place to place, changed names, and disappeared for a while, so their disappearances were not seen as something extraordinary. Police inaction allowed the criminal to continue his activities with impunity. It wasn't until 1998 that an official search for the missing women began in Vancouver. This happened after concerned citizens handed the police a list of over 30 women who had disappeared without a trace on the streets of East Side in previous years. However, even then, the police were reluctant to take on the case. The initial check of the list revealed nothing suspicious. Some of the missing were found alive in other cities. Others died of diseases or overdoses. It seemed there was no cause for concern. The case only moved forward thanks to Detective Dave Dixon, who decided to dig deeper. He personally reviewed all the missing prostitute reports and compiled a new list of 16 women. All of them were last seen in the East Side area, starting from 1995. Such a number of disappearances in a relatively short period could not be a simple coincidence. Dixon managed to create a special task force to investigate these cases. Despite the obvious similarity of the disappearances, even within the task force, not everyone was convinced there was a connection between them. Some police officers believed the women might have voluntarily left the city in search of a better life. Theories were proposed about their possible departure to other cities or even countries. There was a lack of facts that unequivocally pointed to criminal activity. The situation began to change when news of the investigation leaked to the press, causing a public outcry. Journalists began their own investigations, interviewing acquaintances and relatives of the missing, drawing public attention to the issue. Under pressure from the media and public activists, the police had to step up their efforts, especially after human remains were found on the outskirts of the city in the fall of 1998. This forced investigators to consider the possibility of a serial killer operating in Vancouver. A large-scale investigation began. All possible leads were checked, and potential suspects were followed. The Vancouver police received assistance from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The number of missing women cases investigated by the task force reached 31. An unprecedented search operation was launched. However, the investigation's success was limited. The investigation lacked experience in such cases, as Canada had not previously faced crimes of this scale. There were no bodies, crime scenes, or physical evidence for a long time. Only fragmented testimonies from acquaintances of the missing women, which often contradicted each other. The lack of information generated numerous rumors and speculations, which only hindered the investigation. Some progress occurred at the end of 1998 when task force detectives received information from Bill Hiscox, a man who had worked on Robert Picton's pig farm. Hiscox reported that strange things were happening on the farm. Prostitutes were often brought there, suspicious people constantly roamed around, and most importantly, women he had seen with Picton later disappeared without a trace. Hiscox claimed he saw items belonging to the missing women on the farm and was convinced Picton was involved in their disappearances. This information forced the task force to focus on Robert Picton. It turned out he had a history of violent incidents. In 1997, Picton was accused of attacking a woman he nearly stabbed on his farm, but the case was mysteriously dropped. Other women also complained about Picton's violent behavior, his passion for sadism, and his strange sexual habits. All this made him highly suspicious. However, there was still insufficient evidence to arrest Picton. Detectives put Picton and his farm under covert surveillance, hoping to capture something incriminating. But Picton, if he was the killer, was very cautious. He seemed to sense he was being watched and gave away nothing. Moreover, some influential people among his acquaintances stood up for Picton, so detectives were advised not to rush to conclusions. The investigation hit a dead end. Meanwhile, the disappearances continued. In 1999 to 2001, another 20 women went missing from the ill-fated East Side, and all this happened against the backdrop of loud parties that Picton continued to hold on his farm, ignoring the authorities' interest in him. The police admitted their efforts were still in vain. They could only hope that if a serial killer existed, he would eventually make a mistake that would lead the investigation to him. But years passed, the number of victims grew, and the long-awaited mistake did not happen. It was only in early 2002, after more than 4 years of unsuccessful investigation, that an event finally occurred that gave the police a chance to expose the criminal and end his atrocities. This event was a search of Robert Picton's farm, which revealed the horrifying truth hidden behind the walls of Piggy Palace. The findings in Picton's possession shocked even seasoned police officers. On February 6, 2002, the police finally dared to search Robert Picton's property. The formal pretext was Picton's possession of unregistered weapons, but in reality, the investigators hoped to find evidence linking him to the disappearances of women from East Side. On that day, dozens of law enforcement officers flooded the farm in Port Coquitlam, owned by Robert and his brother David. Robert Picton and his brother were arrested for illegal possession of firearms, allowing the police to obtain a warrant for further searches of the premises. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. All over the farm, which more resembled a junkyard, were scattered personal belongings of the missing women, their clothes, jewelry, and documents. And in Picton's refrigerators, human remains were found, later identified as parts of his victims' bodies. The most horrifying sight was the barn Picton used for slaughtering and butchering bodies. Dried blood and human hair were found on the meat hooks, and under the floor, teeth and bone fragments were discovered. Along the walls stood barrels filled with a foul-smelling liquid containing decomposing human remains, which Picton used to feed his pigs. It was a gruesome scene. One of the officers involved in the search later recounted, "The stench of decay was so unbearable you could hardly breathe. It felt like we were in hell on earth. I had seen dismembered bodies before, but what we found at Picton's was beyond description. It was like being in a horror movie." The farm was literally filled with evidence of horrific crimes. In piles of trash, criminologists found sawed bones, teeth, and strands of hair. In the freezers were limbs wrapped in plastic bags, and buried in the backyard, barrels were full of partially decomposed remains. To examine all these gruesome finds, a whole army of experts worked on Picton's farm. For months, they sifted through tons of soil and debris, searching for the smallest fragments of evidence. Overall, the search lasted almost 2 years. During this time, remains of 48 women were found on the 6.8-hectare property, although only 27 could be definitively identified. During the searches, it was revealed that Picton liked to photograph and videotape his victims in various stages of dismemberment. Hundreds of horrifying photos and recordings were found on the farm. Some showed Picton posing next to severed heads or mutilated bodies. He seemed to take pride in his horrific deeds and kept these trophies as mementos. Witness testimonies gathered during the investigation complemented the picture of Picton's atrocities. For example, sex worker Lynn Ellingson, who attended his parties, said she saw a woman hanging on a meat hook in the barn with her skin peeled off. Another witness, Bill Hiscox, who worked for Picton, confessed he had often seen him lure women from East Side to his trailer, only for them to disappear without a trace. During interrogations, Robert Picton mostly remained silent or proclaimed his innocence. But in one video recording played in court, he confessed to a friend that he killed prostitutes and fed their remains to pigs. "The best way to get rid of a body is to give it to pigs. They eat it quickly, along with the bones and everything else," Picton's voice was heard on the tape. As it turned out, Picton lured his victims to the farm with promises of drugs and money for sex. There, he drugged the women and then attacked them. Some he strangled to death, others he killed with a sledgehammer or hammer. Afterward, he dismembered the bodies in the barn using a chainsaw and knives. The remains were thrown into acid barrels or used as pig feed. Some body parts he scattered throughout Vancouver, discarding them in dumpsters or landfills. The more details of the investigation came to light, the greater the shock to Canadian society. People could not believe that a maniacal killer could operate for so long in a civilized country, destroying dozens of homeless women. Many blamed the police for negligence and bias, as the disappearances of East Side prostitutes had been known since the 1980s, but the authorities ignored the problem for years. It was only when the number of Picton's victims reached staggering proportions that the police finally recognized the serial nature of the crimes and launched a large-scale investigation. But even after the first searches of Picton's farm, several months passed before he was finally arrested for the murders. In the meantime, he likely managed to destroy many pieces of evidence. On February 22, 22, Robert Picton finally ended up behind bars. He was charged with the murder of 27 women, whose names were identified from the remains found on his farm. But the real number of victims of this monster, according to law enforcement estimates, could reach 49 or more. At the time of his arrest, Picton had a reputation as a quiet and friendly farmer who sometimes sold meat. None of his neighbors had any idea about the horrifying secret of Piggy Palace. The trial of Robert Picton, which began in 2007, became one of the most high-profile and extensive in Canadian history. He was charged with 27 counts of first-degree murder committed between 1995 and 2001. Most of his victims were prostitutes, drug addicts, or homeless women from the troubled East Side neighborhood. On the defendant's bench, Picton behaved calmly and showed no remorse. The jury took 10 months to review all the evidence and hear 128 witnesses in the case. In their verdict, they found Picton guilty of the second-degree murder of 6 women, whose remains were found on his property. The court decided not to consider the remaining 20 cases, fearing the trial would be prolonged. On December 11, 2007, the judge sentenced Robert Picton to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Mr. Picton sowed death on an unprecedented scale. He disregarded human life and exploited vulnerable women to satisfy his perverted desires. Neither remorse nor humanity stopped him, the judge said during the verdict. For the relatives of the deceased women, this sentence was a moral victory but did not bring relief. Many of them never received official recognition of the death of their loved ones, whose remains could not be identified. Others accused the Canadian justice system of leniency, as Picton effectively received the minimum punishment for his atrocities. The case of Robert Picton left more questions than answers. Why did the police ignore the disappearances of homeless women for so long? Did the killer act alone, or did he have accomplices? How many victims actually died at his hands? Unfortunately, we may never know the whole truth. Picton never repented and remained silent until the end of his days. The investigation into the disappearances of women in Vancouver's East Side was accompanied by numerous shortcomings that significantly complicated the search for the criminal and the arrest of serial killer Robert Picton. One of the main reasons was the Vancouver Police's rejection of the new method of geographic profiling developed by Inspector Kim Rossmo. Kim Rossmo, the creator of the geographic profiling method, noted the unusual concentration of disappearances in East Side as early as May 1999. His method involved mapping unsolved crimes and identifying patterns or signatures of criminals that might be overlooked by detectives assigned to individual cases. However, the Vancouver police dismissed his insights and rejected the possibility that the missing women could be victims of a serial killer. Instead, the police claimed that the women might have voluntarily left Vancouver in search of better living conditions. Refusal to work according to Rossmo's method led to his demotion, and he was forced to resign. He was simply told, "You don't understand anything, and your methods are childish." This internal conflict only worsened the situation. The police were left without concrete evidence of a crime for a long time due to the absence of bodies or crime scenes, significantly complicating the collection of forensic evidence. Furthermore, Canada's violent crime tracking system did not monitor missing persons without specific evidence of a crime, further complicating the search. Problems also lay in the reluctance of pimps and sex workers to cooperate with the police due to fear of possible arrests. Resources were limited despite growing media attention to the case. Several suspects, such as Michael Leopold and Barry Thomas Niedermeyer, were considered, but none were found guilty of the women's disappearances. Evidence was insufficient, and the police focused on a few suspects, leading to wasted time and resources. A key moment in the investigation came when Bill Hiscox, who worked on the Picton brothers' pig farm, reported that women visiting the farm disappeared without a trace. Despite his testimony and suspicions, the police did not pay due attention for a long time. It wasn't until 2002, when the police issued a warrant to search the Picton's farm for suspected illegal firearms, that evidence linking Picton to the missing women was found. The impact of rejecting the new profiling method and investigation shortcomings led to many tragedies. The Vancouver police spent years searching for the criminal, during which dozens more women went missing. Delays and insufficient resources allowed Picton to continue his crimes. The refusal to work with Rossmo's methodology, which could have helped find patterns in the disappearances faster, led to lost lives and immense suffering for the victims' families. The shortcomings of the investigation and rejection of new methods underscore the importance of effective coordination and use of modern technologies in criminal investigations. Refusal to cooperate with profilers and insufficient resources can have catastrophic consequences, as happened in the Robert Picton case. Taylor Palmer, a 12-year-old girl, had her whole life ahead of her, but unfortunately, she met a terrible fate. Being an ordinary teenager, she became a victim of inhuman violence. Taylor's mother, sensing a serious threat to her daughter's life from her tyrant husband, placed her under the care of the Child Protection Center. The woman hoped this decision would keep the girl out of danger and give her a chance for a better future. However, as it later turned out, the mother's good intentions only worsened the situation for young Tia, as Taylor was affectionately called by her loved ones, and soon a horrific tragedy occurred. Under pressure from her tyrant husband, Cindy, Taylor's birth mother, was forced to hand her daughter over to the Child Protection System. She sincerely believed she was doing the right thing, as circumstances required saving the child. The woman, herself a victim of domestic violence, sought to protect her daughter from a similar fate. Due to the lack of opportunity to properly raise the girl in strained family relationships, Taylor grew up to be a troubled child. She often ran away from home to avoid conflicts between her parents and had a propensity for vagrancy. In January 2015, by decision of the Child Protection Centre, 12-year-old Taylor was sent to a wonderful family living in the town of Chambers Flat, about a 40-minute drive from Brisbane, Australia. It was a quiet and cosy town with a population of around 500 people. The Thornburns became the foster family for the girl, a household consisting of the head of the family, Rick, his wife Julie, and their 2 sons. The elder John, 19 years old, and the younger Trent, 18 years old. By that time, Taylor had already managed to change several foster families. For one reason or another, new families did not suit her due to the girl's difficult character. Some considered Taylor quite a conflicted personality. The Thornburn family was no exception. Young Taylor was dissatisfied with the prospect of living with 2 teenage boys much older than her. However, she had no choice. Taylor's new foster parents, Rick and Julie, had been married for over 25 years at the time. Rick, a former truck driver, had to switch to lighter vehicles due to a serious back injury. This led him to start his own business selling fast food from a van, and he also owned a horse farm. Julie, his wife, opened a home daycare. Throughout the district, the Thornburn family had a reputation as a decent, respected, and exemplary family, so the Child Protection Services chose them as a foster family for Taylor. For 4 months, it seemed that the girl had settled well into her new family and continued to live there until the tragic events that followed. Taylor attended Morrison State High School, located just a 20-minute drive from the Thornburn home. Outwardly, life seemed to be getting better. Everyone got used to Taylor, and she seemed to get along with her new household members. But as it turned out, not everything was as cloudless as it might have seemed at first glance. The morning of October 30, 2015, seemed ordinary for the Thornburn family. Rick, as usual, drove his foster daughter Taylor to school and returned home to repair his car. But just a few hours later, a disturbing call came from the school. Taylor had not shown up for classes. For the girl, this was not the first time she had run away. With a difficult childhood behind her, she was used to escaping her problems in this way. However, this time, unlike previous instances when Taylor would quickly return on her own or be found, the girl vanished without a trace. In desperation, Rick posted on social media, describing the situation and begging anyone who might know Taylor's whereabouts to come forward. Unfortunately, his plea went unanswered. The girl's foster family knew that Taylor was eagerly awaiting Halloween and had even prepared a costume, so her disappearance on the eve of the holiday seemed more than strange. Eventually, they decided to contact the police, and soon the teenager was declared missing. However, no serious search was conducted, as everyone assumed the girl would soon return after another runaway attempt. A little less than a week had passed since the foster child disappeared. Suddenly, early in the morning on November 5, 2015, a chilling call came to the police. A local fisherman who contacted the emergency services reported a horrifying discovery. He had stumbled upon a body in the yellowed reeds in the shallow waters of the Pimpama River. The location where the remains were found was approximately 30 kilometers south of where Taylor was last seen alive a week earlier. During this time, the body had undergone significant decomposition, likely aided by both the local fauna and the region's specific climatic conditions. The police officers who arrived at the scene of the terrible find could not even confidently determine the sex of the deceased person, let alone establish their identity. Only after a thorough examination did they suggest that it was the body of a teenager. The condition of the remains was horrific. The body, except for underwear, had no clothing on it. The remains were immediately sent for an autopsy and forensic examination. Comparing details about missing persons in the area, the police assumed that the deceased could be 12-year-old Taylor Palmer, who had disappeared about a week earlier. Later, this assumption was confirmed by the results of a DNA analysis conducted in the laboratory, and the worst fears of law enforcement came true. During a thorough examination of the body, experts concluded that the terrible injuries, initially mistaken for animal bite marks, were most likely inflicted by a person. It became clear that the girl had become a victim of brutal violence. The case was immediately reclassified as a murder, and an investigation began. Considering the fact that Rick Thornburn was the last person who likely saw Taylor alive, investigators began the inquiry by talking to him. From the very beginning, Rick aroused suspicion with his strange behavior and inconsistencies in his statements. However, all of this had yet to be thoroughly checked and proven. It was also decided to question other members of the girl's foster family, as perhaps one of them had more information. Unfortunately, interrogations of family members yielded no useful information. Everyone, as one, confirmed the words of the head of the family that he had taken Taylor to school at 7:50 a.m., and no one had seen the missing girl since. After that, the investigators went to the school to confirm the family's testimony, and it was there that they managed to obtain more valuable information. The detectives spoke with all the 7th grade students in Taylor's class, her friends and teachers. Over 100 people were interviewed in total. It turned out that absolutely no one had seen her that day when she was going to class or even near the school. After examining the surveillance camera footage from outside and inside the school on the day of the girl's disappearance, the detectives became convinced that Taylor had not come to school and had not been spotted near the entrance, which was strange. Where then could the girl have gone? However, there were female students, Taylor's friends, who claimed that their classmate had serious problems at home. One of them said that Taylor had begged her to take her home because her foster parents were treating her badly, and she was in for big trouble with them. But the friend, due to her young age, could not make such decisions for her family and bring Taylor home, and she didn't think it was that bad. But soon after, Taylor died a terrible death. This happened literally a week before the girl's disappearance. The friend believed that these events could be related. However, Taylor did not specify to her exactly what the foster family was doing to her. After talking to other students, the police concluded that Taylor had no enemies and no one else would have harmed her. Suspicions about the foster family intensified, and investigators continued to check the Thornburns. But the foster family members categorically denied all accusations of domestic violence against them and claimed that Taylor was making everything up. As in the case of previous families from which she had run away and also complained about them, the police verified this information and found that Taylor was indeed prone to running away and was a difficult teenager. All the people close to the family, as well as neighbors, claimed that this was an exemplary family. Many took their children to their home for a private daycare, and no one believed that such decent people could have done anything to Taylor. Everyone thought she had simply run away, invented a story about being mistreated, as before, and got into some trouble and became a victim of an attack. Therefore, the police, having no grounds for suspecting the family, left them alone. This family also seemed exemplary to them, and they began to look for the reason for the murder elsewhere. Meanwhile, the foster family continued to operate the home daycare. During the investigation, detectives also interrogated about 300 registered sex offenders in the area who could have been involved in sexually motivated attacks. But this did not allow them to obtain a single lead or even the slightest hint of what might have happened to the teenager. Most of them had alibis, and some no longer even lived in the area, so no suspects were identified from this list. On December 4, 2015, shoes likely belonging to Taylor were found 100 meters from where the body was discovered, as well as her backpack that the girl used to go to school. This story became so high profile that it attracted widespread public attention. It was broadcast on many TV channels in Australia, so gradually the whole country learned about this case. On the eve of Taylor's funeral, a series of pickets took place. Outraged citizens demanded the quickest possible solution to the horrific crime and the punishment of those responsible for the girl's gruesome death, which she clearly did not deserve.
The victim's birth mother, being one of the organizers of the protests, persistently sought answers from the police regarding the circumstances of her daughter's death. She appeared on television, drawing the attention of the general public to this tragedy. The woman expressed indignation at the inaction of the Child Protection Services, to whom she had entrusted her child. It was largely thanks to her efforts that over 600 people came to the farewell ceremony for Taylor, which took place on November 14. Most of them had never met the girl during her lifetime, but felt the need to pay their respects. Many of those present were dressed in white and purple t-shirts with hearts and Taylor's name, as purple was her favorite color. About 400 white roses were placed on the coffin, and when the hearse drove off to the private cremation site, purple balloons were released into the sky. 5 months later, since the day of Taylor Palmer's murder, the investigation still had no significant breakthrough. In a desperate attempt to obtain any information that would help the investigation, a reward was announced. The sum of 250,000 Australian dollars, about 160,000 US dollars, was intended to be an incentive for potential witnesses. The girl's mother appeared on television again, pleading for help. She urged eyewitnesses to come forward, and even the criminals themselves to confess. In addition to the financial reward, the police guaranteed immunity from prosecution for any accomplices who, while not being the direct perpetrator of the crime, would be the first to provide valuable information. However, even such unprecedented measures did not help shed light on the circumstances of Taylor's death. Although several calls were received from concerned citizens on the hotline, none of them contained useful information. The summer of 2016 passed, and the investigation still had not identified the main suspect. Investigators worked through one version after another, questioning individuals previously convicted of sexual crimes. However, due to the significant decomposition of the body at the time of its discovery, forensic experts were unable to find clues that would allow them to accurately determine the cause of the girl's death. The only more or less reasonable assumption was the guess about strangulation, as indicated by the fracture of the hyoid bone. The most likely scenario was considered to be Taylor's abduction by a random driver near the school, as the area where parents usually drop off their children was not in the view of surveillance cameras. Anything could have happened there. However, this was just one of many theories considered by law enforcement. The reward of $250,000 Australian promised to anyone who would provide information leading to the arrest of the killer still remained unclaimed. And then, in May 2016, after exhausting months of fruitless work, an anonymous call containing valuable information was received by the state police line. The mysterious informant reported that he had information regarding Taylor and the Thornburn foster family, where the girl had ended up. According to him, the Thornburn couple had been looking for a troubled child from the very beginning in order to receive increased payments for her care. They had no other feelings for Taylor except mercenary interest. Moreover, the anonymous informant expressed a firm conviction that each member of the foster family could be involved, to some extent, in Taylor's tragic fate. Unfortunately, he ended the conversation at this point and did not get in touch again. Attempts to establish the identity of the mysterious Good Samaritan in order to obtain additional information from him were unsuccessful. However, this call prompted investigators to return to the version of the possible guilt of the foster family in the girl's death. After all, at the very beginning of the investigation, they had received signals from students about domestic violence in the Thornburn household. However, at that time, these testimonies could not be confirmed, so this line of investigation was temporarily abandoned. Now, however, the detectives decided to take a closer look at the victim's surroundings again. Trying to verify the words of the anonymous informant, law enforcement officers re-interviewed some of Taylor's classmates. One of the girl's close friends told about her confession of an intimate relationship with the younger of the Thornburn couple's sons, 19-year-old Trent, who was considered a real handsome man. Due to her age, Taylor did not fully understand the nature of this relationship, naively considering it a manifestation of romantic feelings, as Trent assured her. The girl had even managed to fall in love with him and was delighted with the horses that the family kept on the farm. At the same time, young Taylor was terribly afraid not only of Trent, but of his entire family, which is why she sought to escape from them by any means. It was suggested that in the Thornburn home, in addition to sexual abuse, there could also be brutal physical abuse of the foster child. These testimonies from the classmate undoubtedly required thorough verification.
However, numerous repeated interrogations of family members yielded no results. Everyone, as one, continued to categorically deny the slightest suspicion of wrongdoing, especially sexual harassment of a minor. Nevertheless, given the seriousness of the accusations, the local authorities decided to temporarily suspend the Thornburns' license to operate a daycare center and also revoked the family's permission to care for foster children. Law enforcement officers installed listening devices in the suspect's house. Almost every day, they managed to record shocking details that completely destroyed the image of a respectable family that the Thornburns had so carefully cultivated. In particular, it became known that on October 29, 2015, just the day before the girl's disappearance, an emergency family meeting took place. During this meeting, Trent informed his parents about the suspicious abdominal pain that Taylor was complaining about. This caused the couple great concern and even suspicion about the possible pregnancy of their 12-year-old foster daughter. As it turned out, shortly before Taylor's disappearance, the Thornburns learned about the intimate relationship between the girl and their younger son, which took place when no one was home. According to Trent himself, recorded during the wiretapping, he repeatedly had sexual intercourse with his underage foster sister. This relationship lasted about 10 months, practically the entire period during which the girl was under the family's care. Eventually, when they suspected that Taylor might be pregnant, the 19-year-old young man turned to his parents. He was terribly afraid of possible publicity, as the 7-year age difference de facto made him a criminal. However, the head of the family, Rick, reassured his son, assuring him that he would take care of solving the problem himself. Judging by the overheard conversations, the girl was terrified of her foster father. More than anything in the world, she feared the prospect of being left alone with him. Apparently, these fears were not unfounded. The rest of the family members were also openly horrified by Rick, because under the mask of a respectable family man hid an extremely cruel and dangerous personality, which was later confirmed. The evening after the aforementioned meeting brought new horrific events. Rick, having driven all the household members out of the house except for his foster daughter, was left alone with her. When, as agreed, the rest of the family members returned a couple of hours later, the girl was nowhere to be found. When asked about her disappearance, the head of the family flatly stated that Taylor had run away and the problem with her was solved once and for all. "She definitely won't tell anyone anything now," he grimly summarized. A chilling guess flashed through the minds of the relatives had the father killed the girl.
If he was so sure of her silence. When one of the brothers dared to check her room, Rick strictly forbade him to do so, threateningly stopping his son. None of the Thornburns even thought of contradicting the all-powerful head of the family, so everyone simply kept silent about the incident. Thus, the falsity of Rick's story about how he allegedly took his foster daughter to school, after which she disappeared, became obvious. The fact is that in reality, he physically could not have done this. At that point, Taylor was no longer in the house, and most likely, she was already dead. However, what exactly Rick had done to her remained a mystery even to the man's closest relatives. Thanks to the wiretapping of private conversations in the house, detectives repeatedly witnessed Rick instructing everyone on what to say and how to behave so as not to arouse unnecessary suspicion from the police, and everyone obediently listened to his instructions. Law enforcement officers decided to begin interrogations with the couple's sons and their mother, rightly believing that they would be the easiest to break. And indeed, when investigators began to operate with the facts known to them, the interrogated gradually began to provide the necessary information. The longer the communication lasted, the clearer the terrifying picture of what was really happening behind the closed doors of the Thornburn home became. Everything indicated that Rick had arranged everything as if he was trying to protect his family. After carefully studying the footage from the outdoor surveillance cameras near the school, the police realized that the head of the family had gone to great lengths to disguise his crime and create a false alibi for the investigation. For example, on that fateful morning, he did drive in the direction of the school, and his car was captured by several cameras. But none of them recorded the girl getting out of the car. After these stunning revelations, the Thornburn family was hit by a barrage of accusations and public condemnation. Julie and George were accused of giving false testimony and deliberately misleading the investigation. Trent was accused of sexual violence against a minor, and Rick was charged with premeditated first-degree murder, an attempt to confuse the investigation. He had intentionally mutilated the victim's body so horribly to make it impossible for forensic experts and the police to confirm her identity. And this worked to some extent because at first, even the gender of the deceased could not be established. Fortunately, despite all efforts, it was impossible to completely exclude the possibility of identifying the body. Obviously, Rick was unaware of the existence of DNA analysis. In addition, law enforcement had strong reasons to suspect Rick of years of brutal physical and sexual abuse of all the children in the family, including his own. In total, at least 9 serious charges were brought against this monster in human form, and some of them did not even directly relate to the deceased girl. Trent was accused of debauchery and giving false testimony to the investigation. The family car, which, as it turned out, was hastily sold shortly after Taylor's disappearance, was taken from the new owner for a thorough inspection. Blood traces were found on it. These stunning events could not but affect Rick's health. On the day of his arrest, while in custody in a pre-trial detention center, he lost consciousness. The man's condition was so severe that doctors had to put him into an artificial coma. However, after a few days in the hospital, Rick regained consciousness. Medics suggested that he had deliberately provoked the exacerbation by taking some medications. Fortunately, this monster in human form failed to escape responsibility for the crimes committed. Eventually, all members of the Thornburn family appeared in court one by one. The cynicism and cruelty of their actions so shook the public that people literally craved reprisals against the entire family, capable of such inhuman brutality towards a defenseless girl. The evidence provided by the prosecution was so eloquent that the arguments of the defense were practically not taken seriously by the court. Julie and Joshua pleaded guilty on all counts and agreed to testify against Trent and Rick. The jury did not have to deliberate for long. They unanimously found all family members to be real monsters, guilty of various crimes. As a result, Joshua was sentenced to 3 months in prison. His mother received a 1.5 years for false testimony. Trent, who also confessed to everything, was sent to prison for 4 years for incest, perjury, and obstruction of justice. Currently, the mother and sons are already at large. Trent, who repeatedly raped Taylor, was released from prison on January 19, 2018, having spent only 16 months there. The main sadist of this story, Rick, received the most severe punishment. During the trial, he confessed to the murder of Taylor, which he brutally committed in the barn, and the subsequent concealment of the girl's body in the river to save the reputation of his son and the entire family. In addition, the man was found guilty of a number of other serious crimes. In May 2018, the court sentenced him to life imprisonment with the right to parole no earlier than 20 years. The shocking details of this case caused not only a wave of public outrage and close media attention. The Australian legal system undertook a thorough revision of the legislation governing the principles of protecting children transferred to the care of foster families. As a result, a number of improvements were introduced aimed at strengthening control, especially in terms of identifying potential criminal elements among candidates for guardianship or persons who already have problems with the law. In addition, several new norms appeared concerning the care of minors with deviant behavior, as well as requirements for married couples applying for the adoption of such children.